Looking forward to standing up in York and talking to you all.
Hear Steve.
Can you hear me all right, Ben?
Yeah, good stuff.
Yeah. You got me all right, Ben? All right. Can somebody just give me a thumbs up and tell me you've got the sound?
Yes, we have, Steve.
Good. Thank you very much. Yeah, my apologies. I can't be with you in person. I love coming up to York, but I did think I would still put my PWI jacket and tie on to talk to you all tonight. Underneath the desk, I've got jeans and slippers on, but up above the desk, I hopefully look fairly smart. So this is my reflections on things I've learned in my 15, 16 years now in the railway industry. I think the first thing is looking about lessons learned on presentations. Keep it short, don't use too many words, and use lots of photos. Well, I failed on the first one because there's about 45 slides, and hence my comment before that you might want a cup of cocoa, because it could go on, but I will try and get through it at pace. Therefore, because there's so much to try and get through, I'm not going to be able to elaborate on every point. I could probably do a whole day with the material that I've got, with throwing in a few anecdotes and stories, but I'm going to try and go through it at pace. So as Ben said, I left in October 22. I set up my own business called Satchel. Satchel is the first two letters of safety, change and leadership, which is hopefully the services that I can provide back. And as Ben said, I'm working predominantly with SME companies, and I'll go through some of those later on. So my first reflection is on safety. And as Ben said, I joined in 2007. I joined in the aftermath of the Lambrig train accident. Pendolino came off at high speed, ended up in a field up in Cumbria near a place called Lambrig. Margaret Massam sadly passed away, and many others were seriously injured as a result of that. I spent time in the Carlisle Crown Court as the then maintenance director representing the company in the aftermath, and I was brought in to try and fix maintenance. And first thing was proof of maintainability. It's a very, very important document. I don't think that we spend as much time on proof of maintainability as we should. In the case of the Lambrig derailment, there was a proof of maintainability document. It had been signed. The process had been gone through. But the reality was it shouldn't have been signed because the local maintenance team could not reasonably maintain those assets with the amount of access that they had, and the access points and the equipment and the time that they had. Something to encourage you all as things change, and I think we're going to go through a lot of change over the next few years. Make sure that when things change that you look at using the proof of maintainability process. Maybe even when things don't change, it's a good process to go through, just to challenge yourselves to say, have we got the right number of people, the right amount of access, the right kit, the right competencies to be able to maintain the asset properly. Next up was terms and conditions aligned to access available. The terms and conditions that we looked at, or that I had, meant I had a lot of people on days, and increasingly we run trains on days, and we do maintenance at night or at weekends, and the terms and conditions weren't aligned. I still don't think that's fixed. I don't think the current dispute is going to fully fix it. It's something that that the railway needs to fix at some point. Something that's a big success of the safety task force is making the CESS a maintainable asset, something I wish I'd done 15 years ago. It's amazing how many safe CESSes that we've had that have become overgrown with weeds and buddleia over time, and therefore the safe walking route has been lost. Really, really pleased to see the progress on that. Prep for safety, something that we introduced in track, pioneered by Bill Cook, to try and say, before we go on to track, let's make sure that we try and prepare the access point and the work site to be as safe as possible. And the last thing is, I've lost count of the number of times I've nearly fallen asleep during safety briefs, and I'm trying to pay attention. We have to consider the average attention span of a typical track worker and try and make sure that the safety brief fits inside of that, and that gives you 2 to 3 minutes max. And I've gone way beyond that many times. So Reflections on the key risks at work. When I started with Network Rail, the number one risk was being hit by a train. When I left, the biggest risk was fatigue. Falling asleep after a shift, driving home was the biggest risk. And the second biggest risk was having a heart attack at work. The third biggest risk was still getting hit by a train. We'd made a lot of progress, and it's good to see continued progress on removing the risk of getting hit by a train. But as we remove that risk, other risks appear, and we need to manage those as well. Lone workers, there are a lot of things that lone workers do. I'm not convinced that I ever put in place good systems to back up lone workers if they were hurt in the role of or disabled in some way in the course of doing the job. And a challenge for all of us: how do we back up our lone workers? Ballast dust. One of my reflections, and it's an interesting cost versus quality debate. I think we buy cheap ballast. The specification's probably too low. That creates dust. Everybody out on site, or people that are out on site regularly, you know when you've got decent hard ballast that isn't going to produce dust, and you know when you've got soft ballast that's going to produce a lot of dust. I think it also reflects on the installed life of the ballast. I'm pretty sure that the softer ballast that creates a lot of dust is going to need renewing sooner than the really hard granite that we occasionally get. CDM. Applied in both maintenance and in projects world. First thing I learned, or one of the most important things, is CDM maintenance and CDM projects are different. They are very different, and it's important that people understand that. Something I would challenge everybody as a lesson for me is understand CDM, train people in CDM, and then make sure people understand their duties and audit to make sure that people understand their duties and that they are fulfilling their duties properly. I've lost count of the number of times where people had duties but didn't realize they had the duties, and they definitely weren't discharging them properly. Grip and pace. I love grip and pace. We introduced grip for track at the time. To me, grip and pace are really the collected wisdom of railway engineers going back over the last 40 or 50 years. We learn a lot of lessons. Things happen, we do reports, we write lessons, and then that lesson is often crystallized into the grip and the pace standards. I think sometimes we can be too slavish to them, and we need to use them like a menu and select what's right for your project. But I think they are important documents. Similarly, delivering work within possessions, introduced after some well-known overruns. They were actually introduced after the Rugby and Liverpool Street ones. The picture on the right is one of my worst Christmases, worst times in track when we overran at King's Cross. I'm sure most people on this call will remember that. I think the DWWP process really important to understand what your risks are. QSRAs can be manipulated, so please, one of the lessons for me: check the assumptions. You can get any answer if you change the input assumptions, so make sure that you confirm that the input assumptions are correct. And then also beware the as wells when you've got possession of the track, particularly at Christmas and Boxing Day. It's amazing how many people say, "Oh, while you're there, can we just do this as well?" And suddenly you find that all the jobs start tripping each other up. Really important that people pick the right supply chain. It isn't always about price. It often isn't about price at all. The successful projects are the ones that get the best supply chain. The way of doing that is during the procurement process, make sure that you ask the right questions. If you ask the right questions, then you should get the best suppliers for your job. One of the things that surprises me, how many people don't recognize that suppliers have to earn a profit. And I use the word earn a profit rather than just make a profit. But people think their job is to sort of screw the last little bit of margin out of the supply chain. And if you carry on doing that, you won't have a supply chain. And the supply chain at the moment there are a lot of headwinds that the supply chain are facing at the moment. The first of which is inflation. And it's a long time since we've had high inflation. Not many people can remember what it's like. Not many people can remember how to deal with it. But the inflation levels that we are running at the moment, 10, 11%, are making huge challenges for the supply chain and for Network Rail themselves. Cost of labour, cost of materials, cost of hotels, cost of travel, cost of diesel. Everything is going up and is really, really challenging the supply chain at the moment. The other thing that's challenging the supply chain is the cost of debt. It impacts a couple of things. It impacts cash flow. Often the supply chain have to spend money now because they've got people that need to be paid this week because they've provided materials or labour. So they have to pay their suppliers before they get paid themselves, and often they get paid 60, sometimes 90 days later, depending on how smoothly the payment process runs. And all of that cash flow has to be financed, and the cost of financing that is linked to the base rates, and that is obviously costing an awful lot more now to finance that. The other thing is suppliers with high amounts of assets, which is probably the things like the plant suppliers. That asset has to be financed. So if you are a medium-sized or smaller supplier with say 100 pieces of RRV, and they cost say £400,000 each new, that's £40 million. If they're half depreciated, that's £20 million. And if the cost of debt has gone up by 4 or 5%, which it has, then the extra cost of just financing your assets is between about 800,000 and £1 million per year just to finance the assets. That is often well beyond the margins that these companies are making, and that is putting a lot of pressure onto the supply chain. The importance of plant reliability. When we looked at reasons why we overrun, plant reliability was the number one. And I took responsibility for it because in a former life, when I was the maintenance director, I put the plant contracts in place and we drove them on price. Remember before I said not everything, price isn't the most important thing. I learned that lesson the hard way. I sent a very clear signal to the supply chain that what I really wanted was cheap plant. When I grew up, I realized that what I really wanted was reliable plant, but I had cheap plant. It had 96% reliability, and it caused us all sorts of problems that led to overruns, which generally led to me being carpeted on a Monday morning by somebody somewhere. Over the course of a few years, we got that to over 99% reliability across the whole fleet. It made a huge difference to our ability to hand back on time. The Rail Plant Performance Scheme was key to that. High-speed handback's one of the things I'm most proud of in the track community. It's great for passengers. I set the team the challenge of handing back at 125 mile an hour across all of our delivery streams, which were high output, plain line, and S&C. And Ben was first with high output. They did 125 mile an hour handback quite quickly. Then the plain line team followed, and high output and plain line were really rediscovering the lessons and the tools and the techniques that really were there already 30 years ago with things like DTSs. S&C, nobody had really done that before. So to make sure that we were able to do that with progressive assurance, firstly on trailing points and then on facing points, which was even higher risk. That was fantastic, and both of those were on the Eastern Patch, the first two. In order to make sure that you can hand back at high speed, you need a real mindset of installed track quality. One of the things that we learned was the importance of installing the design position. There was a lot of track engineers will install 50 mil low and then use the tampers to bring it up. So you get a perfectly solid bed that we've whacked the living daylights out of to make sure that we've got a brilliant track stiffness. And then we lift it by 2 inches with the tampers, and then we lose all of the quality that we'd installed. So it was a real confidence thing to get people to install to the design position. So the tampers are really then just finessing and the DTSs are fully consolidating. And a big shout out for the Plaza 4S tampers, which I think were game changing in our ability to hand back S&C at 125 mile an hour. Some of you will, I guess everybody on the call will recognise that's the Newark Flat Crossing. The importance of installed reliability. We started looking at hand back failures, or things that we'd handed back on time, but then weren't reliable. In my early days in track, we had a set of S&C that failed 26 times in its first year, or on average every 2 weeks there was a failure. Very embarrassing, since we'd spent many millions of pounds of the route's money and then gave them a very unreliable asset. We worked on all the potential causes of failure and made sure that we tried to remove those before we handed back. One of the key ones is hand tamping around all the points of failure on S&C, particularly the pits that the tampers can't get to. Now, it's amazing how many people are interested in track renewals. We probably 80–90% of the company's overruns relate to track renewals in some way, shape, or form. And people are therefore worried all weekend about, are you going to hand back on time? Or in the case of high output, which Ben used to run every night, are you going to hand back on time? Regular reporting is so important to tell people that we're on time, we're okay. Now, sometimes jobs get into distress. We run with, we have to replan them, and we have to advise that jobs are running behind schedule. My advice would be have a separate distribution list for when jobs are running behind, because lots of people now want to know, route control, route directors, ops directors, everybody now wants to keep an eye on that and increase the frequency. Probably in some cases you're reporting every half hour, just to tell people where you are against the revised plan. Welding during testing. This is something that I was hugely proud of, made a big difference to our high-speed handback program, because in order to hand back at high speed, everything had to be welded up. And in order to weld everything up within the time that we had, you have to be able to weld during wheels free. There were two particular signal suppliers that we liked working with, which were Tix and Volgas, and they both let us weld during testing. And because what we'd all worked out together is that during what's called wheels-free testing, there are an awful lot of tasks which don't really require full wheels-free. When you are setting up the S&C, doing the basic communications tests, you don't need to be full wheels-free. And during that time, we can drop welds. There is a point at which the signal testers say, right, now I need you all off, because I need to go full wheels-free so we can do all the final testing and commissioning. If you pick the right signal testers, that works incredibly well. A story I mentioned before, one of my worst jobs was the overrun at Finsbury Park, and a few years later we went back to do the other half of Finsbury Park, and our plan was to hand back at 80 mile an hour with everything welded up. And unfortunately, in Silver Command, we're some signal engineers. Signal engineers really struggle with the concept of welding during wheels-free testing. And I was out on site, and the program manager was in a very heated conversation. And eventually, he handed me the phone and said, "Steve, can you speak to them?" I had no idea who I was going to speak to, so I said, "Hello, Steve Featherstone here." And they said, "This is Silver Command. We believe you're going to try and weld during testing." And I said, "Yeah, we're going to drop 72 welds. I've got 12 teams that are just turning up." And they said, "Well, this is Silver Command, and we are issuing a formal instruction. You are not to weld during signal testing." And I turned around down the phone and said, "Right, can you put this in your log? This is Steve Featherstone. I am Gold Command, and we are about to drop 72 welds." At which point I realised, if those 72 welds hadn't have been dropped and we hadn't have handed back on at 80 mile an hour, I'd probably just signed my resignation letter. But thankfully, everything went very, very well, and I was really pleased with the team. Talking of signalling, I thought I'd put some things in on signal maintenance. One of the things, my observation on signal maintenance is that the more and more digital, the more and more modern our signal maintenance equipment becomes, the more it seems to get obsolete faster. So if you look at some of the Victorian signalling with the lever frame boxes, the lever frame signalling, it's all still there. We can still maintain it. Sometimes you have to go to a local blacksmith and get things reverse engineered, but we can still maintain it. Some of the signaling systems that were installed 20, 25 years ago, the manufacturers, the OEMs, the maintainers are already saying we can't get spares, and within future regulatory submissions, they are including obsolescence because they can't maintain the equipment. So I think one of the things in terms of signal maintenance, and I guess it's part of the proof of maintainability that we spoke about right at the beginning, is if a signaling system should say last 40 years, right at the very beginning, when you've still got project managers, original equipment manufacturers on site, make sure that you've got sufficient spares and a plan to avoid obsolescence during the 40-year life cycle. Otherwise, it won't make it. Remote condition monitor and reliability center maintenance, which we used to call RCM squared, hugely important to get the reliability of the assets up. And during my time as maintenance director, we reduced failures by 30%, and a lot of that was around RCM squared. We also learned the importance of lubrication and the difference between dry and black lubricants, and also knowing where to lubricate. For those of you that lubricate S&C, the most important bit to lubricate is the heel of the switches. It's the bit that moves the least. It's counterintuitive because you think you should put most lubricant on the bit that moves the most. The bit that moves the most generally has got big motors behind it. The bit that moves the least is the point. There's the inflection point or the heel of the switches, and that's the bit that needs lubricating the most. Also on signalling, particularly after Potter's Bar and Lambrig, we learned the importance of fasteners, particular fasteners that won't come undone under the fatigue cycles of the railway. And setting up S&C as a system, I think we do that increasingly well. And the final lesson was maintenance teams and delivery units are experts at a particular type of S&C. And this was something that probably the starkest example was when somebody decided to install a set of HPSS up in Perth, in Scotland. HPSS switches will take a tilting train at 125 mile an hour. Perth don't have 125 mile an hour tilting trains. They had no other HPSS, and somebody gave them two sets to look after on a turnout from a train depot doing 20 mile an hour. They lasted about 3 months before the local team said, we just can't get our heads around these. This isn't the sort of kit that we have, and the maintenance team took them out and replaced them. Similarly, a delivery unit in the south of the country, we gave them in-bearer clamp locks, or the projects gave them in-bearer clamp locks, because that's what the specified design was. Within a matter of months, they'd taken them out and replaced them with HWs. Not because in-bearer clamp locks or HPSS aren't really good systems. They are. It's around what the maintenance teams know how to maintain, know how to fault, carry the spares on the vans. So it's really important to think about, give the maintenance teams what they know. Performance management, the old adage, what gets measured gets managed. I used to love league tables and things that were really important. We managed by the day because then they got managed faster. I loved and introduced share with pride, copy with pride, and share with pain into both the maintenance organisations and the track organisations. Really keen to understand things that weren't going well and to and to make sure we improve them. It's very rare that anything happens in the railway for the first time, so make sure we learn the lessons. And I guess from a maintenance perspective, always plan 2 seasons ahead. So we are now in the spring. Good maintainers should now be planning for the autumn, and in the summer they should be planning for the winter. And there's a lot of work now on design your system to be well maintained and reliable. I remember having the mushrooms of an axle counter in the middle of the 10 foot in the middle of the West Coast main line because somebody thought it would be a good idea. You know, you had to actually block two lines of the West Coast main line to be able to get to the mushroom to be able to maintain them. Lesson from a plant perspective, hire companies tend to have really cut price rates for hiring kit, and a lot of them make their money based on loss, damaged, and poor client management practices. When I was track director, the difference between one depot and another depot was about a factor of 100. One depot over the course of the year had £8,000 of loss and damage. Another depot had £800,000 of loss and damage. You know, so really keep an eye on loss and damage. We often spend many millions of pounds renewing the infrastructure, and the passengers don't see it at all because they're travelling over the top of it and they can't see it. But what passengers do notice is lineside graffiti, lineside buddleia, lineside litter. So actually, something I used to ask the teams to do, and I'd encourage all of you to do, is spend a little bit of money on a project to paint out the graffiti, clean up the buddleia, cut back the buddleia, pick up all the litter, and probably the most publicity I ever got of a track renewal was when we took 57 tons of general detritus off the throat of Euston when we had it closed for some major works over one of the bank holidays. And we made pretty much every national newspaper because we removed 57 tons of rubbish and painted out all the graffiti. So it's an important thing to think about. The importance of midweek working. You will find a lot of people at senior in government, in Network Rail, they want the workforce to be PAYE fully employed, and so does everybody. But if you look at the access patterns, we've been saying we want more midweek work since all the time I've been in the railway. And one of the things that you have to look at is that, but during that time, every franchise that comes out seems to want earlier trains and later trains and more trains at weekends for leisure traffic. And that's great. That's the service that we provide. That's when passengers want to travel. There are people wanting. I love going out to the theatre and I want to get the 11:30 train home. But that means that any work on the track can't start until well beyond that, by the time the trains have got back to their depots and possessions have been taken. So it's fully understandable from a passenger perspective, but more and more work is getting squeezed into Saturday night, Sunday morning. And that means that we need more and more weekend warriors than ever before. I'm hoping that with GB Railways, we may see that pattern broken. I'm hoping that GB Railways will be able to create more access, and we'll see how that progresses. Comment on late orders. It's really surprising how many times the supply chain are given late orders. They often know that it's coming. They've had a verbal order, they've had a phone call, but late orders are a real challenge for the supply chain. They're often caused by the number of signatures that you need before you can issue an order. That increases the delivery risk, it increases the quality risk, it increases the price risk. And the answer to all of those risks is to increase more bureaucracy. So somewhere we need to actually break the cycle and be able to give purchase orders to the supply chain and not expect them to operate at risk. Access points, really important. And I think my comment on this is that over the years, we have sold off far too many access points, particularly inside the M25 for housing projects. The bodies at the time, be that Railtrack or Network Rail, have made a decent profit on selling that off, but it makes it very difficult for us now to have decent, high quality access points where we can get onto the railway quickly and do what we need to do. So a quick walk now through some of the companies that I work with. CC Infrastructure Services. They do graffiti and litter removal, anti-graffiti coatings, heritage brickwork. The top picture is the quadripartite arches at Waterloo. My favourite part of the Waterloo rebuild was always the quadripartite arches. It was only when I started working with CC Infrastructure Services that said, "Oh, we did that. We took all the brickwork back to its original form." That's lovely. St Pancras. The statues there, on the top right, they clean those, and obviously they grit blast and paint iron structures. Geobear, geopolymer injection company. Some jobs that we did on the top right, or the top of the screen. They are a Kentish town leveling the slab tracks. At the bottom left is embankment stabilisation at Severn Valley. A big shout out to an event on the 28th of March, which the PWI are hosting at the Institution of Civil Engineers on behalf of GeoBear, where we're going to reveal the results. I'll give you a sneak preview. It's great. It works. It's fantastic. We can now stabilise embankments. But if you want the details, we can reveal them on the 28th of March. Bottom right, job from last weekend is a level crossing where we increased the stiffness of the formation by a factor of 4, which should mean that the track, both the track and the road, will now stay where they are supposed to be. Select Equip, I call them the general hardware store of the railway. They're great innovators, and the picture on the right there is me and Henry with the fish plate upgrade kits, which I'll come on to in a second. Stay Tight, they provide nuts and bolts. I never realised that nuts and bolts could be such a fascinating area of the railway, and how many nuts and bolts fail. And I guess if we go back to Potter's Bar and Lambrig, that was the reason that hardlock nuts were introduced, because the root cause of both Potter's Bar and Lambrig were bolts failing with vibration and fatigue. They are, the hardlock nuts and bolts are a key part of the fish plate upgrade kits. Something that you may be able to see on the bottom right picture, which we showed at the PWI event in Manchester. That's the photo from the PWI event in Manchester. Is our Stay Tight have now got an instrumented bolt, which we are hoping to put onto a temporary clamp, which should mean for if you think about. I mentioned before that on the installation at Finsbury Park, we dropped 72 welds. If we hadn't have been able to drop all of those welds, we would have had 72 temporary clamps, and each of those would have had to be inspected every day in line with standards. If we can get instrumental smart bolts that tell us that they're still in place and are still maintaining their clamp force, then we can hopefully go away. We remove the need to inspect every temporary clamp every day, which will take, which will be great for safety, great for cost reduction, and great for the operational railway and for passengers. Interflon, they make specialist lubricants and cleaners. Started off with slide share lubrication. They provide the lubrication for fish plates. They provide a leaf guard, which is the best autumn treatment product that we've had. So I'm helping them to introduce that. And we're also doing some trials at Penrith on an overhead line, ice guard, to look at reducing the amount of arcing on overhead line during the winter, which should reduce the wear and tear on pantographs. They sometimes in cold, icy weather, a train going from London to Scotland can wear out a pantograph on a single journey, and if we can make a difference to that, that would be fantastic in terms of keeping the trains working and providing a great service for passengers. And there was a great quote from a track maintenance engineer down in the southwest, who basically said, "If it moves, we Interflon it." Next up is the fish plate joint alliance. This was unfinished business for me when maintenance was devolved. This was the next project on the to-do list. We'd done a lot of the research. We knew that it worked, and then somewhere in devolution, it all got lost. So I went to the manufacturers, Stay Tight and Interflon, that provide the bolts and the lubricant, and said, should we do it as a supply chain? Really, really pleased with the support that we got from Network Rail, who were able to give us approval in 6 months, which is somewhat of a record. I got the supply chain to work together with Select Equip as well to put kits together. The reason is that bullhead bolts and flat bottom bolts have different lengths. You can think which one may or may be the longer one, and I guessed and I got it wrong. So flat bottom actually have slightly longer bolts than bullhead. If the bolts are too short, you can't get the nuts on properly. If the bolts are too long, then your socket won't fit on properly. So it's really important that you get the right bolt. So I decided we should have kits, and those kits should say very clearly, this one's for flat bottom and this one's for bullhead, and it removes the risk of the teams fitting the wrong type and just trying to do the best they can with the kit that we've given them. I also now work with the Rail Plant Association. I think they recognise that since the devolution of track, they'd lost their voice. Between them, they own over £1 billion worth of plants, and they have over 5,000 workers working for them. But they'd lost their voice, and hopefully, I'm starting to help to get them connected again and to get them in with the right conversations. Peer consulting, I work with peer consulting, or a way of me being able to work with tier zeros, which is essentially Network Rail, because when you've left Network Rail, you can't work directly for them. So it's an opportunity you have to work via somebody else. So I chose to work with peer consulting, because I knew a lot of the guys there and respected them. Done some work with HS1 on their refurbishment renewal plans and their ballast cleaning. And it was just an excuse to photograph as my two boys, James and Andrew. And this is taken when Ben took us out on a high output shift when they were both still at school. I think that was on the Chesterfield to Derby cleaning shift or renewals campaign.
Certainly was.
So I'm now going to go on to what's on my mind. Now, those of you that have been in my team will know that I always had a sort of what's on my mind agenda, and this was just sort of current stuff. So a lot of the stuff that I've been through so far is stuff that I've learned, lessons that I've learned. What's on my mind is right up to date, and it's stuff that I worry about. So I was really worried about the sofa, and I didn't know what photograph to use, so I took a photograph of my sofa. The SOFA stands for Statement of Funds Available, and it's how much the government are going to give us in CP7. Now, at a headline level, it's actually quite good, because for ops, maintenance and renewals, in real terms, because you've got to do a lot of calculations with inflation and because everything's in cash, but in real terms, ops, maintenance and renewal is slightly up. So that's the good news. I'll now follow on with the bad news. When we then start to look at enhancements, the DFT have to work within a funding envelope, and that funding envelope is how much money the Treasury give them, and out of that, the DFT have to fund all of their portfolio of, which includes Network Rail, it includes National Highways, it includes High Speed 2, it includes East West Rail, it includes Transpennine Route Upgrade. And you can't have failed to have noticed lately that HS2 are overspending. They are trying to manage that themselves. They're trying to push work backwards. That doesn't actually reduce costs, that actually increases costs, but it reduces the amount that you need in any particular year by phasing it backwards in time. So there is a real risk that HS2 are going to go to the DFT and say, we need more money. And that money will have to come from the general funds of the DFT, and that may mean that there is less for Network Rail and other areas that the DFT fund. In terms of general enhancements, we've also seen reduced passenger numbers since COVID. That still hasn't recovered, particularly at peak times, particularly on commuters, which means that the capacity expansion, which has driven enhancements for as long as I can remember, may not be required until their passenger numbers recover. So the impact on Network Rail, Network Rail spends over £2 billion a year on enhancements. Putting that into context, I think the Transpennine Route Upgrade is about £1 billion. So it's over the course of a control period, that's £10 billion. So that's the equivalent of 10 Transpennine route upgrades over the course of a control period. And it's difficult to see where that money is going to come from, and that could have a huge impact on the supply chain. The supply chain often, have concerns about the boom and bust nature of different control periods and different funding and how it arrives. I'm really concerned that CP7 could see a quite deep depression in the amount of enhancements funding, and therefore the amount of overall funding going to the supply chain. I watched Ben sent the link round for Niall's presentation, so I watched Niall's presentation on HS2 to sort of see what he'd said before I commented. One of the things we have to look at with HS2 is why are they spending so much money? And one of the things we have to look at is that for some reason, we decided to build pretty much the fastest high-speed railway that's been built certainly in the Western world. And you've got to think, actually, if you go back 200 years, we invented the railway. We exported the railway around the world. But when it comes to high-speed railways, we really, really need to be followers rather than leaders. And the decision to go with super high speed rather than just regular high speed has meant that so many engineering challenges have to be solved because they are the first of type. I went to a presentation by HS2 last week, a PWI presentation in the Birmingham section, and one of the things that they said was they've just awarded the contract for their S&C to Voestalpine. Voestalpine will make it in Germany. They'll transport it to Britain. The challenge that they've got is they've never built anything that big, that fast, and they don't know how to transport it, even 100 yards down the road, never mind between countries. And all of those problems have to be solved, and all of those problems build in cost. So why did we go for such high speed? One of the reasons is that the DFT funding book, the faster trains go, and we'll see this in Network Rail on line speed improvement programs. If you improve the speed, then theoretically you get more passengers. If you get more passengers, then you can justify more funding. So if you go with the higher the speed that you say you're going to deliver a railway, the more funding becomes available in the book. And I think that's possibly one of the reasons that we went for such a high speed, was because it allowed us to draw more money down. I think if we could wind the clock back, maybe we should realize that we should be followers on high speed rather than leaders. We should build similar high speed railways to those that already exist in France and in Germany. When it comes to rolling stock, I remember a conversation with Tony Collins, who was the CEO of Virgin Trains at the time. And his proposal, which I absolutely loved but got rejected, was that we should have built the next generation of Pendolinos to go to 180 mile an hour. The first generation of Pendolinos went at 140 mile an hour, but they were restricted to 125 on the British Railway, but they could tilt all the way up to Glasgow. Tony's proposal: build the next generation to go 180 mile an hour and tilt all the way up to Glasgow. Build high speed 2 as an infrastructure to go a lot faster, but for the first generation of trains, just use the next generation of Pendolinos. And I thought that was a great idea. We were going to have the rolling stock anyway. It meant that rolling stock could go down classic lines, it could go into Euston, it could go on HS2. Unfortunately, that was rejected, and we are building dedicated rolling stock that doesn't tilt. So it'll go really, really fast up to the Midlands, and then perhaps won't be able to have enhanced permissible speed all the way up to Glasgow. So it'll be ahead of the clock by the time it gets to Birmingham, and it might be behind the clock by the time it gets to Glasgow. So that's what my thoughts on HS2. I thought about one word to sum up each control period, and I think CP5, I think, was very much about safety. I think CP6 is very much driven by passengers, and I think CP7 will be driven by costs. I think money is going to be really, really tight. I used a picture of people doing sleeper changing. I think that the good old-fashioned techniques of keeping old assets working is going to be really, really important, because I think we are going to see a lot of assets going beyond the age at which we would normally have renewed them. And I think that £2 billion a year of enhancements that I spoke about, an awful lot of that was actually renewing tired old assets, but under enhancements funding. And if that disappears, those tired old assets are still going to be in the system. I got into a conversation on LinkedIn on freight, so this is on my mind. I think decarbonisation, and everybody understands hopefully decarbonisation, and I personally want to see more freight transported on the rail, and various commentators have said that, you know, hopefully we'll be able to have 3 times as much freight on the rail as we do now, and that would be great. But it's important to remember that the freight variable usage charge doesn't cover the additional wear and tear to the railway infrastructure. It never has. If it did, it would price rail freight off the railways, or price freight off the railways and onto the roads. Therefore, it has a charge, but it isn't a fully cost reflective charge. And if we have 3 times as many freight trains, then we will need to find additional maintenance, a budget beyond the variable usage charge. Next on the mind is devolution. And one of the comments or one of the questions I get asked probably most as I go around is, what do you think of devolution as it worked? I obviously I devolved 2 national teams. I devolved the maintenance team in 2011, and I devolved the track team in 2019-20. So I've had a lot of experience at devolution, and those of you that have worked in my teams will recognise the scorecard that I have always used. I've used this for 30 odd years. Safety standards, customers, suppliers, people, and costs. And I thought I'd look at devolution in those dimensions and think, you know, what has devolution done for us? Safety. Are we safer? Has there been a step change? If devolution hadn't have happened, would we be as safe? Probably we would. So I don't think devolution can say it's changed safety, probably one way or another. Standards, are the standards better as a result of devolution? Arguably not. I think it's a real challenge in a very devolved organisation to maintain the standards that we had. I'll come on to that when I come on to people. Customers, the big thing about devolution was it was supposed to improve stakeholder management, improve customer satisfaction by being far more local. If you look at the latest customer surveys, and I know some of them have been impacted by industrial action, it doesn't feel like passengers and customers are really feeling that thrilled about us at the moment. So, you know, jury's out as to whether devolution has really made that much difference for customers. Suppliers, I work with a lot of suppliers. I talk to an awful lot more than those that I support as a consultant. Devolution's been a real challenge for suppliers, because it's really hard to work out who you have to sell things to. And on the fish plates, for example, back in the day when I was national maintenance director, they would have had to convince the national team, they would have had to convince the national reliability team, and once they were convinced, it would have then been an implementation program, and we would have managed the implementation across the country. Now we have to sell not just the idea of a region or a route. You're almost feeling like you're selling it section manager by section manager, and that's a real challenge for the supply chain. If we come on to people, I think there's 2 dimensions to people. When you devolve, instead of needing 1 person, sometimes you need 5. Sometimes you need 14 if you go to routes. Sometimes you need 19 if you go to regions and routes. And I'm not sure that there are enough good people to go around in a devolved model. So I have a challenge as to, you know, as you devolve, how do we make sure we get enough good people, and have we seen a dilution of the competence and capability through devolution? Another thing on people is just the sheer number of them. When I looked after maintenance in about 2008, 2009, we developed the 2020 vision. The 2020 vision was a catchy title, but it was designed by 2020, and we give ourselves 12 years to get there, to get the maintenance organisation down from 18,000 to 12,000. So when I joined, I had 18,000 people in maintenance. There were 34,000 people in Network Rail. My plan to bring maintenance down as a national team to 12,000. The operations team, I think, had about 8,000, and they were planning to close lots of the small signal boxes, create the big regional signalling centres, and they were going to reduce, I think, from about 8,000 to 5,000. And there were various other headcount reductions planned. And if all of those plans had gone ahead, by 2020, the Network Rail organisation should have had about 24,000 people from the 34,000 in 2007. When I left in 2020, there were 44,000 people. So there were 10,000 people more than when I started, and I thought there should have been probably 20,000 less. And what has Devolution done? It's meant we've got an awful lot more people. And you look at it in costs, probably the biggest cost of Network Rail is people. And if people have gone from 34,000 to 44,000 for what is fundamentally the same railway, I know we've put a few more wires in the air, perhaps, and a little bit of redoubling, but fundamentally it is still the same railway that we had in 2007. The costs follow the people, and if there's 44,000 people, then there's an awful lot of cost. And I think the big challenge, as I said before, for CP7 is going to be bringing costs down. And I think it's only a matter of time before questions are asked to say, if we are really, really going to get serious about costs, can we persist and continue to persist with the devolved model? Thought I'd give some comments on industrial action. Right up to date. Probably the main reason I'm not in York today because of the industrial action. The supply chain have really felt the impact of short notice cancellations. About £20 million worth of work have been lost by the plant supply chain. That is many times more than when Carillion went into administration. When Carillion went into administration, there were central teams put together to make sure that the supply chain were all okay. But the drip nature of the industrial action means that the supply chain have really been hurt, but there hasn't been any support available or offered. I remember dealing with the trade unions. I used to spend an awful lot of time over beer and curry talking with the trade unions. An awful lot of what we discussed formally was pre-agreed over beer and curry. Occasionally we had pizza, but it was there was an awful lot of really good relations with the trade union. They'd been built up over many years, preceding when I joined, and I hopefully carried them on. But the people dealing with the unions had been there for an awful long time, and they knew how to have conversations. I think one of the things I've seen in my time in Network Rail is we've lost that real back route conversation with the trade unions, and I think it's we need to try and recover that some way somehow. And the final thing on trade unions. Modernising maintenance. I think it's really just 2BC. It's just 2BC was due to be implemented. Went live about 6 or 8 weeks before maintenance devolution. So while it went live, it was never really implemented properly. So it's good to see 12 years after 2BC was agreed that modernising maintenance is effectively now going to bring it in. I said that to a Network Rail director last week, and he said, "No, Steve, you're wrong." And I said, "Well, tell me anything that is in modernising maintenance that I couldn't have done under 2BC." And he thought about it for a while and said, "No, you're right, Steve." So that's my thoughts on that. And if you'll be glad, this is the final slide, and I managed to keep within my hour, which is pretty good. When I first started, there was a phrase that I heard in 2007. I'd never heard this in the gas industry before, and the phrase was guilty knowledge. And I'd never heard the phrase in the gas industry, but the phrase guilty knowledge was quite prevalent within the railway. And generally, generally in the space of, or don't tell me that because now I've got guilty knowledge. I wish you hadn't told me that. I've now got guilty knowledge. This was a real strange concept to me. I like knowledge. I don't really mind whether it's good knowledge, bad knowledge, good news, bad news. I want to know knowledge. I want to know facts. If I've got those, I can assess them. I can assess the risks. I can look at the options. I can make decisions on what we're going to do. But I really, really want to know what's the reality. And I think there was a culture going back a long time in the railways, and I think it's still there, that people don't like to communicate bad news. So one of the things that I guess is bad news at the moment is maintenance backlog. Maintenance backlog is higher than it should be. I had 3 independent conversations to confirm this before I put it into my slides, that maintenance backlog is now getting towards the levels that it was at the time of Lambrick. And that's a real concern. Now I know there's been a whole lot of industrial action, but the maintenance backlog was already creeping up before then. So generally, I then asked, what about the top 21? Now the history of the top 21. When I was maintenance director, I set a team up and I said, tell me. I said, there's thousands of maintenance tasks. Everything from cutting back the bud layer at an access point through to a facing point lock test. I said, tell me the things like facing point lock test that are really, really important, the things that are going to derail a train, the things that are going to really, really compromise our license to operate the railway. And the reason it became known as the top 21 was when the team came back, there were 21 maintenance tasks that were the absolute critical ones. And therefore, that became the top 21, and we measured those separately from the general maintenance. So I said, so if maintenance backlog's high, that could be a problem, but what's happening with the top 21? And I got the answer, which really, really concerned me, as well, we don't know. And I said, well, why don't you know? And I said, well, we stopped measuring it because really nobody seemed to take any notice of it. So I'm really, really concerned that maintenance backlog's up and that nobody's really, really focused on the top 21. Somebody used a phrase with us, and that's the reason I put it in inverted commas, because it's not my phrase, and I've not heard it before, and I had to look it up on Google, and I've put the definition there. But somebody used a phrase with me a few weeks ago, and they said that what we are seeing now is a normalization of deviance. So I had to look it up and think, what does normalization of deviance mean? And it says the normalization of deviance is a phenomenon in which individuals and teams deviate from what is known to be an acceptable performance standard in the adopted until the adopted way of practice becomes the new norm. In other words, if I've got a maintenance backlog, but I look at all my colleagues and they've all got a maintenance backlog as well, that makes it all right because I'm just doing the same as them. So that's a real concern. So, and my final thoughts before we sort of open up for questions. We are heading into an area where we are going to be constrained on costs. We've got a good news culture, and I think a combination of a good news culture in combination with real serious cost constraints, I think could lead to really bad things happening. And I came into the railway after Lambrick, and it feels to me like we are potentially heading towards something like that unless some counteraction is taken and soon. And that concludes my presentation, Ben.
Thanks, Steve. Certainly thought-provoking. Any questions? If you've got a question, feel free to type it in the chat, or alternatively, feel free to put your hand up and we can cover questions that way either. Okay, we've got a hand up. Ian's waving his hand at me as well.
The old-fashioned way, Kitch.
Shall I go to Tapua first as a first hand up, and then I'll come across to Ian if he's got a question as well.
Good evening, all. Representation, Steve. My name is Tapua. I'm an assurance engineer for Northwestern Central in the EMP department. Just a thought I want to ask. You've mentioned that we're going to move into as we move into CP7, we're going to have constraints around funding, and without that funding, you've mentioned that obviously we've got a huge maintenance backlog. What do you think we should be focusing on to obviously avoid or mitigate the risk of us finding ourselves where we have serious incidences?
Yeah, thank you. Good question. I think we've got the challenge isn't necessarily a CP7 one, because we have a maintenance backlog now, and that's in CP6 with CP6 funding. But if the ops maintenance and renewals funding is the same, then unless something changes, we will continue with that. But then the £2 billion of enhancements funding that potentially isn't there, that actually took out an awful lot of old assets, that could make the situation worse. Within my slides, I had something around the importance of measurement. To me, we really need to make sure that we are measuring the maintenance backlog. We are measuring the avoiding loops that people take by redating jobs to make sure that we've closed all the loopholes. We need to measure the top 21, and we need to be discussing those at the highest levels in Network Rail. And I think that will make a real difference. But my impression at the moment is that those things aren't discussed at the highest levels, and until they are, I don't think things will get fixed.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks,
Thank you.
Steve. Ian, you managed to come off mute.
How's that? Yeah.
There you go.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah. Steve, thank you for acknowledging that some things were right in BR days, especially the line speed handbacks.
Yeah.
Because over at Peterborough, we did over 100 in the final year.
Yeah.
So there are things that were there. But myself and a number of other retired persons who I meet with, we all share the concerns about the future for the maintenance, and as you talk about. But one of our concerns is the training of the staff. In BR days, we had a whole series of training courses which took people from basic trackman right through their supervisory grade. Does that still exist?
I think a lot of them do, and to be fair to the PWI are really starting to fill that space now on technical training, with a lot of veteran engineers now providing their time to PWI to train the next generation, which is great to see. I think the other thing that we should be very aware of, and you can see the field gun shirt on the wall behind me, which I'm hugely proud of, is the apprentice program and the training around apprentices and the number of apprentices and graduates that we've brought in over the years. So I think training has always been good. I think succession planning is good. Whether the formal stuff that you mentioned there, Ian, is as robust as it was back in British Rail days, I don't think I'm the best person to comment.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thanks, Ian. David.
You're on mute, David.
Sorry. Hi, Steve. David Worsley from Transport for the North here. I was working in Network Rail Project Risk and Value back when DWWP was first brought in. You mentioned it earlier, and you said you thought maybe some of the QSRAs were manipulated. Now, I remember when DWWP was first brought in, there was a sudden, big improvement when we insisted on 95% confidence before you could hand back on time before you could go ahead. But then there was some backsliding after that. So there was a sudden improvement, and then things started getting slightly worse again in terms of handbacks. And at the time, we suspected that people were manipulating to get passes when they wouldn't have. Is that what you think happened?
What I used to do is check the assumptions, because effectively the QSRA takes each individual task, and you have to input the quickest time they think you can do it, the probable time that you think you can do it, and the worst case time. And it's actually the worst case time that drives the QSRA. And if you if you aren't honest, or you aren't realistic rather than honest, if you aren't realistic in some of those, this could, we'd like it to take 4 hours, but it could take 7 hours. If you aren't realistic in some of those input assumptions, then you can get the QSRA to say whatever you want. And therefore, when I was a little bit unsure, I used to always go back to the input assumptions and say, what are you putting in? And do I believe that they are credible ranges? And if I believe they were credible ranges, then I believe the QSRA output. But if somebody was determined to get a QSRA through, the way that they would do it is to manipulate the inputs, and then the output is just cranks through the model.
Yeah, so that's what I thought was happening in the end. So I'm glad you spotted that as well. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Cheers, David. Thank you.
Thanks, David. Pete.
Hi there. Yeah, it's Pete Lindley, SigTech Rail. Further to Ian's comments about training, and where everything's going, a lot of it is subcontractors managing the work, either managing the projects and the tasks, or you get the labour supply. And it's a skills devolution we've got. Obviously, everyone bangs on about the skills gap, but it is skills gap. There's a lot of common sense experience that's been lost. Now, where I've come from, I'm British Rail, and I've now got my own company, and I've brought it up to bring on and educate people and bring them in through mainly signalling. We're a signalling company, but for me, with a lot of it being weekend work, as what you mentioned earlier, it's be nice if GBR utilised midweek stuff a bit more as well, if they could do that. It's hard for me to take on people to train them up and show them the ways of how to do the work and put them through training programs if there's no midweek work.
Totally agree.
It's a really difficult task, really, really tricky task to do.
Yeah, and I hope that GBR can fix it. One of the challenges that we have with the current regime is if we take a train out at midnight that's got 6 people on it, that train has to be paid for. Network Rail has to pay to take that whole train out, and the compensation is very large, not necessarily reflective of the number of people that are on the train. When GBR starts to look at the whole railway, it can maybe look and say, actually, Thursday nights, Friday nights, they're busy. We've got a lot of people coming home from the cities late at night. Actually, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, the late trains aren't that busy, and we can maybe take those out. But then, because GBR is looking at the total railway system, they can think about how much fare box revenue is lost rather than how much the compensation for taking a train out. And it should make the economic assessment different. And I'm really hoping that then allows much more midweek working to be done. And then that helps us to, as you say, bring on the next generation and give them 35, 40-hour week contracts.
Yeah, fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed, absolutely.
Yeah.
Good question, thank you. Any other questions? Okay, it's all gone quiet.
All right, all done.
Steve, I guess just to wrap up, normally I like to learn something new, and for the first section of your presentation, it felt like I was reflecting on lots of things that we lived and breathed together in the past. To be honest, prep for safety, grip for track, pump reliability, high-speed handbacks. It was all really useful to reflect on. The middle part of the presentation tells me if I need nuts and bolts, signs, lubricant, expanding foam, or a statue cleaning, then I know where to come.
Absolutely.
So, but I guess seriously, it's great to see somebody with your experience supporting small medium enterprises in the industry and helping them find their way through the challenging times that you described. And then you finish by giving us your thoughts on funding, on HS2, on devolution, strikes, modernising maintenance, and then a real warning at the end. I think just reflecting on your observations on where we are now and that experience of what you've seen over 17 years. So thank you ever so much for taking time out of your evening to present. I did buy you a beer when we met up 2 nights ago, so I don't feel quite so bad about the fact that I can't do that tonight. So if we could all put our hands together virtually, I guess, and say thanks to Steve, that would be great.
Thank you.
Cheers, Claire.
So before people disappear, the lights have just gone out around me. That's good, isn't it? Our next meeting, just a reminder, is face-to-face in Doncaster Marshgate, so Mallard House, on April the 20th, and focuses on the Doncaster derailment. And we will be having our usual post-meeting drink afterwards at that one. So we'll be in the Draftsman on Doncaster Station, no doubt, for a pint before we all disperse. So thanks again, Steve, and we'll catch up as a group again on the 20th of April. Thanks all.
Steve.
Thanks very much.
Cheers, guys. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Steve.
Thanks,
Thank
Steve.
you.
Cheers.
Thank you.